Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. Please, we're going to start our panel now. Thank you all for coming. We have a really great panel and great panelists for today, and a good crowd of people. My name is Helen Volska, and I am the managing and founding partner of EBS, which is the largest Ukrainian management and financial consultancy firm. And today's session about emerging markets. The world is changing rapidly, and the emerging markets continue to throw challenge to traditional leaders. So what happened in 2019? What is the view of investors in 2019? This is the questions we are going to answer today. We have very good panelists which represent both the global view and regional and Ukrainian view. I'm going to introduce Michael Collins is the CEO of Invest Europe, which is the association for private and venture capitalists in Europe. Michael, please tell us today about the view of the global investors to the topic. Lana Kazani is the founder of Horizon Capital, the largest private equity fund in Ukraine. Andy Hunder, the president of American Chamber of Commerce in Ukraine. And Andriy Kolotyuk, the chairman of supervisory board of Ukrainian Venture Capital Association, and also the founder of A Ventures. So I'm going to ask now each of our speakers just to do the opening remarks on the emerging markets, the trends for 2019. Let's go.
Thanks so much, Helen. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. As Helen said, I'm Michael Collins, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Invest Europe, which is the pan-European association for the private equity and venture capital industry. We've got members across quite literally the whole of Europe. I think we've got at least one member in pretty much every country of Europe, including Ukraine. And it's my job on a day-to-day basis to really evangelize on behalf of private equity and venture capital in Europe. And one of the things I always like to do when I speak in a forum like this is just remind everybody what it is that private equity and venture capital is, what it is that it brings to the story. And at heart, it's a very simple story. Private equity and venture capital is a way of channeling capital from global investors via a fund, through a fund manager to companies. In Europe, there are around about 85,000 companies today that are backed by private equity and venture capital. And what makes PE and VC different from other investment strategies is two things, I think. Firstly, it's a long-term investment. We're backing companies for 5 years plus. It's not a short-term get-in, get-out investment strategy. It's about building businesses over the long term. The second thing that differentiates private equity and venture capital from other investment strategies is that it's a very active form of investment. When people like Lena go in and invest in a company, they're not just taking a small stake and waiting and seeing what happens. They're getting actively involved in building that business. And I think private equity and venture capital has something in particular to offer to emerging markets. And I spend an increasing amount of my time visiting the emerging markets for private equity and venture capital in Europe. As I said, we've got a lot of members in Central and Eastern Europe. And we tend to, when we talk about emerging markets, kind of group them together. And there's a sort of shorthand that we use when we talk about emerging markets. But I think it's important to remember that what differentiates each of those markets is just as important as what brings them together. They differ enormously in size. Ukraine, Turkey are much bigger populations than an Estonia or a Slovenia. They differ in terms of their relationship with the European Union. Some are members, some are not. Some are in the Eurozone, some are not. So when I talk about emerging markets in Europe during the course of this afternoon, always bear in mind that there's that enormous amount of diversity and differentiation as well. Let me say just a couple of words by way of my opening remarks about why I think investors have to have European emerging markets as part of their asset allocation strategy. I think the first thing to say is it's too big to ignore. If you look at Central and Eastern Europe, the combined GDP of Central and Eastern European countries is around about 1.5 trillion euros. If that was a single country, it would be the 5th biggest economy in Europe. That's a scale that you can't afford to ignore. The second reason I think that you can't ignore it is because these are economies that on the whole are very, very open to international investors. I remember just a couple of years ago speaking to a finance minister from one of the Baltic states who said to me, you know, we're a small country, nobody else speaks our language, we absolutely have to be open to the rest of the world from day one. And that, I think, is a message that increasingly has got out to international investors, that the emerging markets in Europe are really keen to bring outside expertise in. And the final thing I would say in my opening remarks to explain why emerging markets have to be part of the story for investors is that there are now some absolutely fantastic success stories coming out of the emerging markets in Europe. Just in the course of the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen massive exits on the VC and private equity side. Companies like UiPath, like TransferWise, and I'm sure Lena will be able to give us a big long list of others. Those successes, those really big returns that some investors have now seen, I think is really starting to make other investors sit up and take notice about Central and Eastern Europe. So I'm really excited to be here today and to offer my contribution to this discussion.
Thank you very much. Andriy, maybe you can continue, as representing the Ukrainian venture capital. What is your view on the subject, and what trends do you expect to Ukraine as a part of the global emerging market in 2019?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. First of all, I need to say that in 2014, when we started, and the very first day when we announced about the forming Ukraine Venture Capital Station, we became a member of the Invest Europe. It's number one. Secondly, because I know you guys from 2003, we had many attempts to launch the association, and our chapter is actually like yours. Okay, so all this legal governance, etc., is like yours. So, which means we are part of Europe. Okay.
We just figured that out.
Yeah.
Exactly. And secondly, we have grown to 57 members. Yeah, majority of them are venture capitalists, it's true. Last year we had 12 new members, majority newcomers that actually came to Ukraine from US, from Europe to invest. So last year, and this was very kind of turning point for Ukraine, we had 2 companies already that become a unicorns, $1 billion valuation companies. And I predict during next 2 years, we're going to have 7. I don't know how many now in Europe, you will tell that, but 7 is a big number, I know that. And so it's 1 point. Second one, because of the last 5 years, 80 American venture capital funds invested in Ukraine. Can you imagine? 80, we see why. Because when we say the Ukrainian startups, Ukrainian IT companies, that means it's a global company, except e-commerce companies, they have sell physical goods. Okay, e-commerce is focused on the Ukrainian market. The rest, on the very next day, on the first day, our entrepreneurs think how to build a global product, how to be profitable, etc., etc. And that attracts the culture of syndication. That means that we invested as seed or Series A, early stage investor, and then we invite any other investors, mainly from US, but also from Europe, to syndicate, co-invest with us. And that culture has been already in place. And this is why I think during the next 2 years, the Ukraine is going to be positioned in the top 3 after UK and Germany, or alongside with them, at the VC and the tech hub of Europe. Okay, this is what they've been working for last 15 years, and this already become a reality. Okay, and this is also because of the work with the European and the international venture capitalists, right? Because as you said, in venture capital, it's about how you to help entrepreneur to build a global company out of Ukraine. So we have this knowledge, we have this legacy, we have everything in place. And as I said, we have 2 unicorns already, which is just the beginning.
Well, thank you very much. Let's just develop a little bit on the unicorns. And you said that Ukraine has 2 now,
Yeah.
and you expect Ukraine will have 6 or 7 in
Yeah.
the very near future. Michael, question to you. What about Europe? Do you know how many other in Europe in last decades, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, it's always difficult to put a precise number on unicorns, but we estimate there's around about 35 to 40 that have been created over the last few years.
So Ukraine is doing quite well.
Very well. This is very, very impressive.
It's a news, by the way, for Ukrainians here as well. So we need to spread this news to the international community, right?
So would you also agree with Andrei's comment that Ukraine is probably going to become, Ukraine and Kyiv probably going to become one of the top 3 European venture capital hubs?
I mean, there's lots of competition, I'm pleased to say, across Europe for that title. We produced a report about 12 months ago at Invest Europe on the growing number of tech hubs that there are across Europe. And I think what we've seen, unlike the US, where there tends to be a focus in 2 or 3 centers, what we've seen is a much more diversified and dispersed set of tech hubs across Europe with different specialisms in different cities. I very much look forward when we produce an update of that report to having Kiev and Ukraine in there as one of those hotspots.
Sure, we are contributing to these reports, this actual AMO association, to provide all the numbers that we have and to invite your members, right, to co-invest with us. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's now look at the view of the strategic investor, and I think Andy is the best person to tell us about this because Andy represents the membership, basically the membership of American Chamber of Commerce to Ukraine. Andy, go ahead.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the competition. There's a lot of competition out there. I head up the American Chamber of Commerce in Ukraine, but we're part of the AmChams in Europe. And I was elected the treasurer, and it's 42 countries across Europe where the AmChams are present. And it's very important to get your voice across. And I think it's very important. What we've been trying to do is get Ukraine, visible on that map, get Ukraine to the table. Because as they say in America, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So if you're not delivering that voice, someone's going to do it for you. And I think it's good that you've got people like Andrei, like Olena. I think we'll hear much more, like events like this one today here on this very the streets that we're on. I think it's very important, and I think it's getting that message across. Because the message, what we're seeing, we do regularly survey our members that are operating in Ukraine. We have over 600 members. The AmCham has been in Ukraine since '92, and we asked them, how was last year, and what are your forecasts for 2019? And 74% of the members are forecasting growth. And then this has a knock-on effect, because then when our members send these statistics to their head offices or their regional office, well, they're saying, well, hang on, if others are investing, why aren't we investing? So it has a sort of a knock-on, a snowball effect. Mm-hmm. And I think, there is a lot of good news out there. Hopefully, and I think, as you say, it's getting these good stories, the success stories out, and this will inspire others to, to have a look at Ukraine and to see, what the opportunities there are, who is there, and what the possibilities there are today.
Okay, thank you. Lana, Horizon Capital, to me, it's been a success story in itself and has a lot of successful investments, and you're the best person to tell how easy or how difficult it is for private equity investor in Ukraine. Please tell us your perspective.
Well, first of all, I'm so happy to see everyone here on this panel, and I also want to thank all the co-organizers who have put this together. I think we've done a great job in terms of Ukraine House, and truly, even with this panel, what we want to do is talk about Ukraine in the context of a global conversation. So when we're talking about investing, And even though my perspective will be focused mainly on Ukraine and the near region, because that is our investment area, still, it's very interesting for all of us, I believe, to hear Michael talk about the broader context of Europe within the globe and the investing, and of course, Andy with all of his stories. I hope you do get into those stories about traveling throughout Ukraine to all of the different strategics that you work with. But in terms of our story starts 25 years ago. Our story starts very similar to those who know enterprise investors in Poland. Started off with the Enterprise Fund, with Western NS Enterprise Fund. With that investment funds, the 150 million, that of course was put to work in 160 companies. No, 40 companies, and 168 million was put to work over the years. And out of that, Horizon Capital spun out in 2005, again, similar to enterprise investors, and started raising private capital and raising private funds and putting them to work. So at this point, it's over 650 million that's been invested in Ukraine and the near region, 850 million under management. And when you look at how that affects, you know, it's 140 companies, it's 46,000 people who have been, you know, touched by Horizon Capital over the years as an investor in these businesses. You mentioned the challenges or how difficult. I would start off with how fortunate I am. I mean, every day I wake up and think, I am the luckiest person on the face of this earth. I know Andrei feels the same way, working with these companies. I mean, to be constantly inspired, constantly, you know, to work with some of the most visionary entrepreneurs in the country, in the region. And that's a blessing. And every day to be able to be part of their story and to be at the beginning and watch them grow and watch them gain scale, enter new markets, and conquer their markets. I mean, it's very exciting. So for me, any issues that come our way, yes, there's issues in Ukraine, of course, just like in any other market. We have our specific issues. But it is an exciting area. I'm glad we're talking about private equity and venture capital because many people don't know a lot about it. Especially in Ukraine, you really only have a couple of private equity houses. You don't have 30, 40 funds, which you might see in neighboring countries. So I think it's very important to understand that there are these kinds of investors, there are venture capital investors, there are private equity, there are institutional, they are strategic, and they're not all the same. They're not cut from the same cloth. They don't have the same investment horizon. They don't have the same objectives. You know, they're different. They have different horizons. So I'm happy to be here today. I'm happy to answer any more questions. But by and large, we love what we're doing, and we love backing visionary entrepreneurs.
Yeah. I like it. There's actually a message for you. If you want to be happy, just come to Ukraine and co-invest with us, right? Exactly.
No,
like they put it like a logo, right?
Honestly, when you run into people and it's they have a very pessimistic view, then by and large they might not be doing what they're meant to do, because if we've been investing, you know, over 25 years through 4 funds and through some of the toughest times, I think post 2008, 2013, 14. I mean, there was a panel earlier when I heard these words that when times are good, then it's easy for everything to go well. It's easy, you don't worry so much about PR or anything like that. Well, for all of us in Ukraine who've invested through 2008, 2000, you know, the post 2009, 10, and then 2014 and beyond, and have put significant capital to work, I mean, you know, that's when that separates the wheat from the chaff, the men from the boys, whatever you want to call it.
And this is how you're happy. Thank you very much. Andy, could you develop a little bit more about the strategic investors and maybe some stories, success stories? Have they really increased their investments in the recent 2 years? Tell us.
Well, I mean, on the way here on the plane today, I was listening to the latest edition of The Economist, yes? And there was this article, you'll see in this week's edition, and it's called Chickenomics, yes? About poultry and how chicken has become a big meat. And it says, Ukraine, I remember this very well, Ukraine has come from being a net importer to a net exporter of poultry, chicken. I remember, 25 years ago, or 96, when I remember, you remember those frozen legs and things. Exactly, yes. And then now, it's a net export of chicken. So I think I could go on, and I have many of these stories, but I just share a few. I was in the Dnipropetrovsk, and then we went to a place called Kamienka. It was called Dniprodzerzhinsk. It's actually where Leonid Brezhnev was born. And so we get there, and it's a really grey day, and we come to this brownfield factory. There's a new member, so we're going to visit him. So we sit down, and I think, what am I doing here? And then all of a sudden, he starts bringing to the table, literally, the products which they manufacture. And he brings a steering wheel to a Bentley automobile. And sort of very humbly, the very Ukrainian humble style, says, this is what we do. And I'm just imagining like Prince Philip or Her Majesty behind the wheel of this Bentley, and sort of the steering wheel made in Ukraine. But it's stories like that. I mean, the automobile sector, I've got lots of stories about what's going on with the automobile sector in Ukraine. Today we're just discussing the DXC, their CEO, massive American company. They've just bought Luxoft for $2 billion. So I mean, IT, there's a lot going on. On our board, Lena is our chair, elected in December of the chair of the American Chamber of Commerce. This year we've got 4 females. And one of them is Kira Rudik. And Kira is the CEO of Ring. And what Ring do, they make these doorbells. You'll see them advertised heavily on CNN. And they started the company 2 years ago in Kyiv with 10 people. So they have 700 people. And Amazon bought the company for $1 billion. But it's also sectors that have been in Ukraine for a while, like the confectionery, Mondelez in. I'll stop on this one because I'll go on but I think Mondelez in Sumy, 30 miles from the border with the Russian Federation, a big factory where they used to melt, mold, and package chocolates, mainly for Russia and also for Ukraine. And post 2014, they had to totally change their business model. So what they do now. I visited the factory, and they work like 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 3 shifts non-stop, and they make Oreo cookies, the iconic American brand Oreos, and which are exported all across the EU. So I think the shift, if the trade was going sort of from from Ukraine to the east or northeast, now most of it is, or much of it is going to west in very different, be it steering wheels, be it cookies, or be it talent in IT.
This sounds fairly. And Michael, you have also designed a very positive picture of investing in emerging markets, but we all know that it's a traditional model of high risk, high return, but it also kind of high volatility, which is backed by all different factors like political factor and currency factor in those emerging markets. What are the downsides or the watch outs, where do we have to be careful about investing in emerging markets?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and I think it's important for all the optimistic perspective that we take, and for all of the good news stories that we share, that we're also honest with ourselves about some of the challenges that exist. Not least because it's only by identifying those challenges and being clear about them that we can start to tackle them. I mean, there's clearly a lot of underlying strengths in the emerging markets in Europe. The sorts of companies that Lena backs, the sorts of companies that are members of the American Chamber of Commerce are all evidence of that. But there are, I think, some common issues that I hear investors talk about when they're contemplating investing in emerging markets more generally, when they're talking about private equity and venture capital in those markets. I spend a lot of time talking to investors, trying to persuade them that this part of the world and this asset class is the one they want to be in. I think the first challenge that I consistently hear from investors is still political risk. Now, perhaps a few years ago, you would have argued that political risk was particularly high in emerging markets. It's, I think now, undoubtedly the case that political risk has become an issue irrespective of where you're investing. You know, we're sat here today in Davos in a week in which the UK Prime Minister has suffered the biggest ever defeat that a Prime Minister has faced in the House of Commons. And it's also the longest shutdown that the US government has ever endured. So the political risk that one might see in emerging markets in Central and Eastern Europe is almost matched these days in developed markets. But it's still there. And I think when you're trying to persuade investors into the region for the first time, they are particularly alert to what they don't know. They're particularly alert to headlines that they've seen on CNN or some brief story that they read in the Wall Street Journal. And while as individual companies, individual investors, there's not very much you can often do about that political risk, you do have to be alert to the fact that it is out there and it's a problem of perception. One of the great things, though, I think that private equity and venture capital's got to offer, and why a firm like Horizon can be so successful, is that you're not investing in the macro story. You're not investing in the overall political and macroeconomic position of a country. You're investing in an individual company, in an individual team, and an individual set of entrepreneurs. And they can cut through all of the noise of political risk and still deliver a great product and a great service. So whenever I talk to global investors about political risk in Europe, I always explain to them that the private equity and venture capital model is the best way for you to cut through that political risk. Second point, there are clearly still challenges with simply doing business in a lot of emerging markets. If you look at the analysis that the World Bank does and others as well on ease of doing business, there's a great disparity between the best performing European emerging economies, some of which are in the top 15, top 20, and the worst performing, some of which are in the bottom 50, bottom 20, bottom 30. And so there are some really simple wins around how quickly you can set up a business, around having a competitive insolvency law that encourages entrepreneurs to try again, getting your tax system right so that it encourages investment rather than discourages it. It's not rocket science to be able to put these things in place, but it's amazing how few politicians are still prepared to stay the course and put those measures in place. And the third thing, which I think is specific really to private equity and venture capital that needs to be tackled, is there needs to be an indigenous investor base. Firms like Horizon are very, very successful at going out around the world and raising capital from international investors. That is a great strength of PE and VC in emerging markets in Europe. But wouldn't it be even better if you had the choice of going to pension funds that had the scale that you see in the UK or that you see in other developed markets? Not that you don't want that international money, but it would be nice to have the opportunity to find a pension fund, an insurance company, maybe an endowment that could back you and not have to spend quite so much time on the road fundraising in London or New York or wherever it is that Lena spends her time. So despite the challenges that are there, I'm still convinced that private equity and venture capital is one of the best ways to get access to the opportunities that exist in emerging markets in Europe.
Thank you. Lena, what kind of investors are interested in Ukraine?
Okay, before I tackle that, I want to talk a little bit based on what Michael opened up. So you mentioned about the doing business rankings, and I think this is really an important measure because truly, I mean, investors, particularly institutions, I mean, they can't do deep dives and figure out every single law that was changed or every single policy win or loss in a country or et cetera. I mean, they use that. It's a litmus test, right? So I think it's very important, you know, for all of us. And certainly my investors were shocked to see that Ukraine used to be in one of those horrific places of 152nd back in 2012. I mean, we were in 152nd spot. That is awful. And Now we've risen 81 spots. In doing business, I mean, we're not in the top 20, but to rise 81 spots to number 71 and to be above Brazil, India, Argentina, and I only measured Brazil, India, Argentina because some of my investors are invested there. So, you know, I would say, well, listen, guys, you know, they're like, well, what's happening in Ukraine? We don't know. And I said, look, just look at this chart. I mean, you're invested there, and Ukraine is 20 points above, and at number 71 and rising. You know, what other, you know, another point, another litmus test that investors were shocked at was Global Innovation Index. And that's something where Ukraine, where typically, you know, you think of India for innovation, you think of other countries, Ukraine is above. I mean, we're at number 43. We're at number 43. That's something, again, that I think collectively we don't do a good job of letting people know, but we're above India. You know, they're at, I believe, 57. We're above them at 43. We're above these other emerging markets. And I think it's very important that by and large people get this information out and do those comparisons, because investors do compare. They compare against markets. You know, they look at Ukraine and say, okay, if you want me to take this risk, then the rewards better be, you know, better be good. And we better be seeing that on the doing business and on the other indices that the country's rising. In terms of, you know, I do want to also address about the general challenges, because every emerging market investor, you know, currency risk, political risk, macro risk, and I think it's up to all of us who are in the industry to think in advance. We can't put it on our investors' shoulders. They are entrusting us with US dollars or euros, whatever the case may be, and they expect to get a return in that currency that is in the high double digits. So you have to embed that into your strategy. And I think that's something very important. I think that's where we do see investors flocking to IT, to export-oriented companies. Why? Because they have that natural currency hedge. For Ukraine has a competitive advantage today. I know that there's a lot of, you know, heartache that's happened in Ukraine. I try to always see the flip side. You know, we had a massive 70% devaluation, massive. On the other hand, the exports are competitively priced. You know, so you do have to accept the situation and work the advantages, and I think the country's doing that in terms of the rise of whether exports to the EU, 30% year-on-year growth 2017 and growing in 2018. We've seen that total pivot in trade to EU. We've seen, obviously, the traditional food and agriculture industries that continue to deliver double-digit growth. We've seen, you know, IT services, 28% year-on-year for the last 3 years. That's enormous. 28% CAGR for IT services. You know, clothing, 20% CAGR. I mean, so by and large, the investors who are interested, they're looking beyond your GDP growth was 2 to 3%. You know, they're looking that in textiles, you're 20%, in clothing, or in ready-to-eat, 15%, in IT services, 30%, and they're drawn to those kinds of companies and those kinds of sectors.
Thank you. But what about the actual investors? What kind of investors?
So answer the question I asked you. Okay. The kinds of investors, contrarian investors, the kinds of investors that we see financial investors, we see hedge funds, we see private equity, regional private equity players. We see family offices, foundations, pension funds, private pension funds, and we see these kinds of investors who are looking for value in an overpriced global economy. So, I mean, they're looking for value. Right now, I mean, if you look in many markets, you're talking about 15, 20 times EV/EBITDA, you know, pricing, and what emerging markets offer, and Ukraine, it's value. It's value that you're getting a fabulous company, a strong entrepreneur, strong systems, you know, very, you know, strategic mind, lots of depth, lots of substance, and it's priced in a value way.
Thank you. Dri, could you develop as well on the point of potential risks for investors, especially on venture capital investors? You know, it's
Well, I would like to compliment Michael, what he said about the venture capital. Well, venture capital is mainly driven by investments in technology companies, and there is no longer emerging markets for technology, okay? We have one global market. Because we don't invest in projects, we do invest in the teams can build the global companies. This is how the venture capital is, right? And basically from this standpoint, there is no political risk, okay? Even the case of Israel, right, this country in the constant war state, and basically it's not the barrier for other investors to actually invest in Ukrainian IT and startup technology companies, okay? It's number one. Secondly, I mentioned that we got the 12 members last year, okay, they joined our association. Majority of them venture capital firms, okay? They come into Ukraine because they do compete for the best teams that are already building global companies out there. So this is why I'm so confident that we're going to be on this top 3 list, okay? We will talk next year and in 2 years too from now, so we will measure that, right? And especially Ukraine introduced this investment happiness index for the Invest Europe. So we have some innovation on that one. So basically, the Ukraine, as you said, is not only about the grain, it's about the brains, which is now translates to the venture capital. That's it. And we have a venture capitals from the angel side to the growth stage, and so it's just the beginning.
So we usually hear 2 opinions. There is no new investment to Ukraine, and there is a lot of like enormous new investment to Ukraine. It relates to the same year, you know, there are deals and there is interest. So do you see a lot of interest in the venture capital area?
Well, I'm not only seeing them, we actually calculating them and we participating. Okay, our members actually close every week 1 or 2 deals. Even our fund is January 22nd, right? 3 weeks. You have 2 exits already. Our fund only, okay, and some of our members as well. This is already happening. In terms of numbers, 2017, the venture capital have tripled. And I know we have still counted numbers for 2018, but I know it's going to be much more than even last year, which was a triple in the previous one. This is how it is. It's just the numbers in terms of deals, the amounts, and the new players that actually get into it. So we have some new members from Silicon Valley that's smart enough to actually come to Ukraine before our startups going global, right?
That's good. That's good.
You know, to add on what Andrei said, I mean, you have to remember that IT was nowhere in the early 2000s. I mean, this is an industry that started very 2000s, but 2003 this is a $110 million industry. Yeah. This is a $3.6 billion industry last year. So I mean, it went from nothing to now it's like number 2 in export of goods and services, 20% share. Okay, so I mean, this is all very new for Ukraine, but certainly has really delivered that kind of a J curve in terms of growth.
And the second differentiator is that Ukraine is the only country in the world that built the 100% private sector, okay, without the government support. Because all the tech ecosystem in the world, from Silicon Valley to everywhere in the world, been pushed, still pushing, including the European Union, by the governments, right? So this is the reason why its industry is private, and this is the reason why we're actually inviting other investors to invest in fund of funds that would actually pull the money into the funds that already been operating on the ground, rather than go directly.
Yeah, I think I would definitely add that. I think the role of the private sector in Ukraine just can't be underestimated. I mean, it's so, I think even like the event we're seeing today, it's the private sector. It's people like Lena, like Andrei, like Yaroslava, like Svetlana, and everyone. They got together and they saw, this is what we need to do. Because Ukraine has a good story to sell. And, it hasn't been doing a good job in selling that. And the government, over the last, 27 years, hasn't really managed to sell that story. And I think what's good is sort of highlighting what the role of the private sector is. The private sector took on that responsibility and is doing it. And I think this is really sort of getting those messages out. But they're also, not only in terms of promotion, but in terms of, rolling up their sleeves and going into government. I remember in 2015, the former finance minister, someone who came from a business background, who left lucrative careers. I remember Valeria Hontreva we discussed today, who left their careers and went into government at the most difficult time. So I think this is the amazing sort of the private sector, how it really has taken on this role, and we're seeing that the results of this taking on this responsibility.
Yeah, I agree with you. Ukraine is a country where the success rate is high, where government is not involved sometimes. At the same time, we are going through the reforms, and a lot has happened, and there have been a lot of good wins, and still a lot to be done. So from the point of view of your membership base, what are the priorities for 2019 in terms of continuation of reforms?
Well, for last year, and we've seen it happen, that the continuation of the IMF program was a #1 priority. But we have the deal, the new deal that's been signed, and I think we're going into 2019 quite confident. I think in terms of predictability, any investor wants predictability. I think Ukraine goes into elections, double elections this year. So we have presidential elections, first round in March, second round April, and then again in October. I think the beauty of it is that we don't know who's going to be the president in April, but that's a sign of democracy. And I think that the democracy is really, it's a sign, because we don't know. I don't know if you saw Tim Ash's piece today, and he's sort of putting out names, and I think it's still very open. But I think what the business sector wants, it's, to see, rule of law is extremely important. So, to have your investment, if there is a dispute, to understand, you can have a fair hearing. I think rule of law is very much. The tax system, be able to take money out of the country, and we've seen that has happened with the reform in the banking sector last year. So that's something we were pushing for. So a lot of this stuff has happened, and I think we've seen more changes in the last 4-5 years than we've seen in the 27 years of independence. And I think the dialogue we have with the government today is probably the best we've had in the last quarter of a century. Why? Because many of these have come from a business background, and they understand how important attracting foreign direct investment is into the country, but also really understanding that treating the investors, the ones that are in the country well already, that they are going to be your best ambassadors selling to the ones that are looking about potentially investing in Ukraine. So I think definitely with the IMF through, with the tax, we've seen a lot of positive reforms in the VAT refunds, which used to be a big problem over the last number of years. That's worked out. So we're going in optimistic, and as I said, 74% of the members are forecasting growth in 2019.
But what are the most expected, really 1 or 2 reforms for 2019? Something which, I don't know, maybe the land reform, which will make a significant difference for investors?
I think land reform, that's a real hot potato, and I think in the election year, we've got members of parliament I see in this room who may be able to comment much better on that. I think it's a hot potato, and I think being realistic in terms of what may happen. But I think the anti-corruption court, I think to really get an anti-corruption court up and running, to have an active one that's free from any interference, I think that's very important, because in terms of, again, we've always had our 3 Ps on the prevent, publicize and punish on corruption. In terms of prevention, a lot's happening in terms of introduction of electronic services, in terms of increasing salaries of state officials, in terms of publicizing, the free media, the civil society are naming and shaming these individuals. And I think the anti-corruption court will be that really sort of the final P, the punishment. And I think the whole sort of judicial reform is extremely important. That's a priority also. Okay.
Ukraine is just one of the emerging markets, and definitely is competing for the attention of international investors with the others. So, Michael, what's your view? What could Ukraine do to become more remarkable, on the global scale?
Well, I think many of the reforms that Andy's just talked about, if you approach this question from a political and regulatory perspective, are absolutely essential, particularly if what you want is long-term investors. Those investors want the certainty, if they're committing to a private equity fund for 10 years, sometimes longer, they want enough certainty that they can possibly get, that the conditions that attach to that investment going in will still more or less be the conditions that attach when they come out. If you can't give them that certainty, and not everybody in developed markets can now give that certainty either.
Yeah.
But if you can't give that certainty, then you'll start to spook investors, particularly if you're trying to encourage investors that have not been in the region previously or not been in the asset class previously. I was in Korea and Japan just before Christmas talking to massive institutional investors there. There are institutional investors in that part of the world that have got literally hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars to invest. They are desperate to find places to put that money to work where they will get a real rate of return that they can't get elsewhere. But they're also quite risk averse. They stick with what they know because often they don't have large, sophisticated teams that can do all of that due diligence, which is why things like these World Bank indexes become so important. But if you can demonstrate that you are continuing to go along that path of reform and staying the course, you'll slowly start to bring them on side. The other thing I think that global investors absolutely want to see is that you're building an infrastructure within the country that is appropriate for the 21st century. And that actually is an area, I think, where emerging markets often have some advantages over developed markets. If you're building some of this infrastructure from scratch, you're building some of this infrastructure for the first time, you can make a leap ahead of some of those more developed economies that are still patching up legacy systems. We heard on the previous panel, it's the same in the corporate world as well. Emerging markets often are able, I think, to, particularly with ICT, to really make that leap ahead and deliver a quality of infrastructure that a lot of developed economies will look at rather enviously.
Lana, what is your view, like the year of elections, is it going to make an impact on your investors, on their decisions? Is it going to make an impact on you as a private equity fund?
Well, look, I mean, we've invested through every president, prime minister, every cabinet of ministers over the last 25 years. So, I mean, by and large, we stay calm. I mean, we see that it's too early to call. It's too early to call is our view. But we do believe that the president and the parliament that will be selected, they will continue a pro-EU, pro-business, pro-reform trajectory because that's what the Ukrainian people demand of them. And the Ukrainian people have shown that they put their politicians' feet to the fire, and they will continue to do that. So I am quite cautiously optimistic about what will happen this year. And then, of course, it follows with 5 years of political stability because you've got now the synchronized presidential and parliamentary elections, so you don't have elections for 5 more years. So that's our view. But also, I mean, we have the luxury of staying out of politicized sectors, and we do. You know, we stay out of politicized sectors. We always have, and I think that has really worked well for us.
Great, and I understand your sector is not politicized.
I agree. Regardless who's going to be next president of Ukraine, we're going to be continue to do good anyway. So that's my view. It's been before. It's going to be like that in
Thank you.
Next years.
Thank you. Well,
Helen, can I just add, you know, what you were saying about the talking to these very large investors in Asia, et cetera, and it just got me thinking, you know, listening to some of the other panels today, and I know that there is a number of people and also people watching in Ukraine, and I think it's very important that we all realize that we all are ambassadors of the country. I mean, and that's very important because when you travel to these countries, when you meet with these, you know, large investors and sovereign wealth funds and other institutions, and you come across a situation where, you know, it happened to me. I was in the offices of a, you know, top sovereign wealth fund. It took me 3 months to get the meeting, and when I met with them, they said, we lost money in Ukraine in a deal, and we won't invest again. And I think that's something that all of us have to remember, is that the more the success stories, that when people, whether you're investment bankers or investors, private equity houses, venture capitalists, you know, these kinds of stories reflect badly for everybody. So this morning when we were listening to Simon and a good country and what a good country does, and I think it's very important for all of us that the country is 27 years independent. You have these success stories. We need to build on that and make sure that all of us are thinking about how it reflects on the country and on its future potential.
Sure. You want that?
Yeah, absolutely. I also was in the Baker incidents in the Korea and Japan, and also in Hong Kong, and I talked to the folks in the associations, and what they mentioned, they've never been in Ukraine, but all of them invested in Israel, okay? and now they want to come to Ukraine because they just figure out that it's a kind of, for them, it's a new Israel in a sense. They've been there before, okay? But if we would not knock to their office, they would not come over. So we're working on it, like you too, right? So we're both working how to attract them to the Europe, right?
So knocking on the door is a very nice way to put it, but the interesting thing is for private investors is how they're making decisions on invest or not to invest. Of course, there is high chain factors like the political risks, the currency risks, all kinds of due diligence that they're going through. But at the end, some do invest, some don't. From your point of view, what is the key factor which is influencing their decision?
I don't think there's a single key factor. I think it differs very much from investor to investor, from investor type to investor type. You know, I think from the perspective of a venture capital fund, you know, some of the most enthusiastic investors are former entrepreneurs, people that know the sector, they are comfortable taking risk. They like being at the cutting edge of a new technology, and they're quite, I think, almost sort of psychologically driven to want to be in an area that's relatively high risk and relatively high reward. And it's right for them to be in an asset class like venture capital. At the other extreme, you come across very conservative pension funds in. I take Asia as an example because I was there most recently, where the last thing they want to do is ever lose any money. The thought of losing money is what keeps them awake at night, and that drives them towards a particular asset allocation strategy, towards a particular view of the world. The opportunity, I think, for emerging markets and the opportunity for private equity and venture capital now, and in fact has been the case for the last few years, is that the cautious investments that they would have made in the past now effectively mean that you're losing money. If there's zero coupon on a US Treasury bond or a Western European bond, you simply can't afford any longer just to go for the sort of ultra-cautious, ultra-conservative things that you've invested in the past. So even those very, very, and I hesitate to use the word old-fashioned, but very cautious investors are being forced by the sheer numbers to start to look elsewhere. What we've seen in Asia is a growing interest in private equity and venture capital, but even then, they have a sort of inherent conservatism, and they say, well, we'll do it in the US. That's the most established private equity and venture capital industry. That's where all the biggest players are. Our challenge, I think, for Invest Europe, for individual funds like Lena's, for associations like Andres, is to persuade them that Europe and emerging Europe also has to be part of that story.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all speakers. Before we go to questions from the floor, can you all give like just a 1 minute closing remarks? Andrei.
So they just opening the question. Well, we have built the good industry. As I mentioned, the unicorns didn't happen overnight, right? But it's a private industry that started 20 years ago, pretty much, and the legacies that we had, which are still people. So we do invest in the people, and we invite anyone globally just to co-invest with us. It's simply that. So we've been doing this, and we're going to continue to do this just for the success of us, building global companies out of Ukraine.
Thank you. Investing in people, that is something I wanted to hear. Andy.
Yeah, 74% of members of American Chamber of Commerce in Ukraine are forecasting growth this year. I mean, it's a year, I mean, our members are bullish. We're bullish. I think we're going into 2019 on a high. They had a good year last year, the vast majority, over 70%, and I think going in is good. I think you know, we are positive. There's a lot of unpredictability in terms of the elections coming up. I think there was a bit of a scare in November when martial law was declared. I think there was a lot of misunderstanding, so we had to clarify what it means, because the perception of martial law is like tanks on the streets and men walking around with Kalashnikovs. And we said, no, it was business as usual. I mean, there was no, around, you know, the businesses that operated, there was no effect. And I think sometimes we just have to get these messages across clearly, what they mean. But as I say, you know, of continued growth in 2019 and bullish and positive.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that too, because I think that the perception and reality in Ukraine is very different. And those that choose to focus on perception, I mean, most, by and large, you may not be able to convince, right? Those that are willing to look past the headlines come to Ukraine to experience it. And we always say, I know Andrei, you do the same thing, is that it's important to come to Ukraine, to come to the country, and to travel, to see what Lviv is like. And you know, people are absolutely amazed when they go to Lviv, when they go to Kiev. They're amazed at the scale of the country, the scale of the country. I mean, it's enormous. And, you know, when we see these investors who come and they see the reality on the ground, then you can really talk about the opportunities. And those that have made those investments, they're going to really win in a big way over the next 5-10 years. I mean, we see it in our funds. You know, our investor base is over 40 institutions, 350 billion in capital. They're not putting every dime they have in Ukraine, of course not. But they are looking at it from a long-term perspective and saying, we like what we see right now. The country is very much, this export story is important, and it's really something that's driving growth in the country, whether food and agro, IT, light manufacturing. I mean, there's been this surge that's powered by the free trade agreement to Europe. And that we didn't have before. And that pivot and that focus on, you know, supplying to Europe, to Western countries, that continues to drive growth in Ukraine. And I think that's going to be a story that we'll see continue over the years ahead.
That's actually a very good story, because it's helping both the exporters and helping the investment market as well.
Yeah, and it's powered by people. I mean, going back to your investing in people, I mean, it's powered by people, and we all know them. We all know these business heroes who have, you know, one of the companies we backed, we backed them not even 2 years ago. They've tripled in sales. This is an IT company, and it's amazing what these business heroes, what these people who are just ignoring the headlines and building their businesses, entering new markets and conquering them, you know, they're amazing.
Thank you.
I think both in Ukraine specifically and in the emerging markets for private equity and venture capital in Europe more generally, the next few years, 2019 specifically, but beyond, are going to be really positive. I think the gradual embedding of private equity and venture capital in these markets is going to continue. It's obvious to anybody that spends even a small amount of time in the region that there are great entrepreneurs and great companies at a great price to invest in. I think the challenge for the next 5 to 10 years for Ukraine and Central and Eastern Europe more broadly is to stay the course on the regulatory front. to continue to encourage investors from outside to want to commit capital, put that capital to work in the region, and simultaneously to grow the domestic investor base. And I think if in 10 years' time we're here again discussing what's happened over the last decade, the one thing I'd really like to see is the birth of a domestic investor base of the sort that you see in a lot of emerged markets, developed markets. Because I think with that, alongside the other strengths that Ukraine and Central and Eastern Europe have got, the future will look really very rosy indeed.
Very important comment on the domestic investor base, and we see it developing, but there is a huge opportunity still in front. Okay, we have some questions from the audience, please.
Hello, everybody. My name is Andrei Tsimbal. I'm managing partner of KPMG in Ukraine. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you all the panelists. I think we had a wonderful panel. I think we had a lot of positive energy and a lot of good stories about investing in Ukraine. However, I would argue that still Ukraine, despite all these examples and increase in activity, receives far less investment than it deserves from a relative point of view, considering its GDP, its size, its prominence. And I'm not talking about venture capitalists and private equity investors. I'm talking about, broader investors spectrum, like institutional investors, like the one Michael talked about, pension funds, and those are risk averse. So my personal view is that the key reason why investors in general underinvest in Ukraine is perception. I think it's been a lot of talk about this during the panel. I think Lena and Michael talked that it just one story on TV is enough to spook investors, etc. So my question to the panelists, and if each one of you can quickly answer, is whether you agree that the perception is a key reason why investors in general underinvest in Ukraine, or do you think the investors are just being smart and properly assessing risk and stay away from Ukraine, in general terms?
Thank you. So is it a perception or is it a conservatism? Go.
It is a perception, number one. As you said, institutional investors or pension funds, they don't want to risk, right? They don't want to take a risk. And this is the reason why the Ukrainian VC market and private equity is undercapitalized. And this is the reason why it's not easy to raise capital if you want to raise it not from the private ones, but from the institutional ones. It's just a perception. They just want to take a risk. It's simply that.
Yeah, I mean, my background was in PR, so I may have a slightly biased thing on there. I mean, I was always told that perception is reality. And very much, if it is a perception, then that's the reality. I think, but it's understanding, diagnosing the issue and then really understanding what's going on. But I see people like Dan Bilak who are, devoting leaving again, lucrative careers and going to work, trying to get Ukraine's message out. I think, it's really diagnosing the issue, which there is an issue, and then finding a solution of the therapy and solving it. So at least I'm optimistic that, we do understand that an issue is there, and now it's how do we deal with it?
Yeah, I think it's it goes beyond perception, and I would challenge that we all need to just not look at one measure or one metric. What was the net FDI, net of bank recapitalizations last year? I mean, we tend to focus on one number, one metric, and be disappointed. Okay, but when I look at it, okay, and I try to simplify things in my mind, right? I invest U.S. dollar funds. I always bring it back to U.S. dollars. But if I look at it, and I remember when Ukraine had pre-2008 a 230 billion nominal GDP economy, okay, which contracted post-2008 to 180 billion, which dropped to 90 in post-2014. Okay, so now it's at 125 billion, and that is largely driven by capital investment and domestic consumption. which doesn't get captured in one little number of what was the net FDI, net of bank recapitalizations last year and the last quarter. So I think what we have to start doing is getting some of these messages out. I mean, frankly speaking, from where Ukraine was in 2014 to the fact that we now have the highest reserves, over 20.8 billion, 3.5 months of import cover, when we had $5,000, as Dan talked about earlier, you know, in the Treasury account. You know, these matter. These stories matter, and this energy that you see in this country driving the IT sector and other sectors that is powered by this new generation, that is something that, you know, you can't capture in one little number. So I would, you know, I always bring our investors to Ukraine. They are wowed by what they see on the ground, by the people they meet, how smart, how talented, how educated they are. That really impacts their decision. I haven't had an investor not invest who's come to Ukraine, you know, and that's really important. And I also think that people factor, all of us invest in people, right? But also, we can't ignore the people factor. You know, you're a guy sitting in a pension fund, okay, who's got to go to his boss and say, to the CIO or to the board of trustees and say, I'd like to make an investment in Ukraine. I mean, okay, you know, that may be uncomfortable for that person, right? So you have to remember the people factor. I mean, I've had investors say, you know what, I love this country. I want to invest, but, you know, I can't go to, you know, I'm not gonna have a job if I go and say, you know, hey, let's put, you know, $100 million in this or $200 million. So helping those people convince their, you know, higher ups about Ukraine matters too. And that's just more work for all of us to do.
Thank you. Do you have a comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm nothing like as well qualified as my fellow panelists to talk about the situation in Ukraine specifically, but it seems to me analogous with what happened to venture capital across Europe over the course of the last 20 years. There has been a perception post-99, 2000 that European venture capital is a graveyard for any investor. And the reason there was that perception was because a lot of investors lost a lot of money during the tech bubble. And what is now bringing institutional investors back into venture is performance. The fact that funds can now demonstrate that this is a sector that will deliver in dollar terms or euro terms or sterling terms, whatever currency it is, a real return. And you can put on all of the roadshows that you want. You can do all of the public relations and perception management exercises that you want. But ultimately, it will come back to the numbers. And for as long as Ukraine or any other emerging market can actually point to economic indicators that are going in the right direction, can point to political and regulatory policies that are going in the right direction, you will start to bring investors back. But unless the facts on the ground, which is ultimately what most investors will base most of their decision making on, not all of it, until the facts on the ground are steering them towards increasing their investment, they won't. No matter how many glossy adverts you put out, or no matter how professional your PR campaigns.
Thank you. We have a question from lady here. Can we have a microphone?
Yeah, I was the first.
No, sorry, I didn't see it.
Orisa Lutsevich, I manage Ukraine Forum in Chatham House, and we actually almost 4 years ago committed to have the only country-dedicated program in Chatham House, and it was Ukraine, because it was either look as something like Russia or something not like Russia, because Ukraine broke with the Russian market so abruptly in 2013-14 that the investors and the policymakers didn't know where to stick it on. But something that didn't come up in your discussion so far is deep and comprehensive free trade agreement that Ukraine has now with the European Union, the most ambitious trade and policy agreement that EU has with any country in the world. So do you see that this is a tailwind for Ukrainian industries and export? Or how do you see it's playing out? And the second question is on brains. Are Ukrainian brains prepared for the kind of economic growth we're talking about? Is there a quality? And how is productivity doing? Because, you know, the the labor has to prepare to serve those FDIs. And what is, on one hand, perhaps state doing, maybe it's not doing in the private sector support, but perhaps in education, to face tomorrow? Thank you.
Yeah, who wants to answer? Was your question to any specific speaker? Okay.
Well,
Yeah.
maybe I'll make one general comment because I know Ukraine less well than the others. It's a slightly flippant response to your question around the importance of free trade agreements. We are about to see a very interesting experiment in the importance of free trade agreements with Brexit. We are about to find out just how significant the rules and the regulations and the procedures and the processes that underpin international trade actually are. My suspicion, and I'm not a trade expert, but I've spent enough time thinking particularly about the financial market passporting implications, for example. My suspicion is that we're about to discover that these kinds of free trade agreements really do matter and the details really do drive behavior. But we're going to find out with a very real test case in the course of the next few months, I think.
Thank you. What about the second question?
I mean, the UK could be looking at Ukraine for the FTA as a blueprint. But on that note, Ukraine yesterday, on Sunday it signed a FTA with Israel. So I think that's going forward. But in terms of the second question, I think in terms of, it's about education. And I think this goes on to the panel that Yaroslava was on about, training the young. But then the question is who trains the business leaders? And I see Sofia Opatska from the Lviv Business School. And I think that's where the role of business schools does come in. Because, this is a Soviet legacy and a Soviet heritage. And I think, the roles that universities are doing, I think, but the Lviv Business School, but the WISE Ukrainian Catholic University, I think that is really it. And I think, there is a lot of change happening, a lot of good learning taking place, and this is a continuing process.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now it's your turn.
Yes, thank you. My name is Olga Afanasieva. I'm the Executive Director of Ukrainian Venture Capital and Private Equity Association, UVCA, which is the member of Invest Europe for all 4 years that we exist. And I would like to make, not a question really, but a comment and to add some, issues that I'd like to discuss regarding mostly venture capital, using the situation that Michael is here. So during recent years, Europe has been doing a lot in order to increase its position on the venture capital market towards the United States of America, because, well, for now, the biggest VC investments are in that region, in North America. And there have been made different steps, and just today in the morning I've read the newsletter from Invest Europe where there was the information that last year there was the biggest amount ever in Europe invested in venture capital, which is about 20 billion euros something. And this is always the mix of two elements, the soft elements and the hard elements. And I would like to add one of each. So first is, I'm also the co-founder of the Community of European Women in Venture Capital. You've probably heard about that. And the thing is about diversity, yeah? And what we have here, we have, female-led organizing committee of Ukraine House Davos. And it's not just about, a lot of women everywhere. It's about the balance, because male are important, female are important, and all together, venture capital market can become the better market. And I would like to share some information about Ukrainian situation, which is quite good, because we have quite a lot of, in percentage, quite a lot of organizations in VC and PE that are led by women, for example, like Horizon Capital, Western NS Enterprise Fund, and also both Association Angels and UVCA are, have the executive directors females. And recently, when we've made the event of our, female VCs, there were about 100 women in Berlin. So this is the first, the soft element. And Ukraine is really good doing in that sense, and I hope the situation will get better. And the second is the hard element, which is, of course, capital, because without it, would be difficult for VC. And Europe is doing a lot in that sense also. The Pan-European Fund of Funds that was founded, and Invest Europe, as far as I know, was one of the biggest contributor in developing of the framework. In Ukraine, but for UVCA, one of the main focuses is actually the establishment of Fund of Funds in order to provide capital for our VCs, and about 10 members in association are fundraising currently for a couple of years. So in that sense, I am like using this chance to invite you to Ukraine and to, you know, like to help to make this dialogue between government and also between the European Investment Fund in terms of pushing this in the agenda of, well, our, I would say, government and private society of fund of fund establishment. So welcome to Ukraine.
Thank you. Well, you're welcome to Ukraine. This wasn't
I
a
kind of
question.
feel like I'm in Ukraine already being here, but I look
kind of
forward to being in
It's even
greater
better
Ukraine.
there.
Yeah, kind of. We have a question here as well.
Olga, I'll try to rope Michael Collins in for invite you for our AGM in October.
Absolutely, I'll be
October.
delighted.
Put it on your calendar.
Just on that fund of funds point, if I may, because I think it's a really important one. You compared the European VC market and the US market. One of the biggest differences between the EU market and the US market is the average size of a venture capital fund. We're just about now, and we've been enjoying really good times over the last few years in Europe, we're just about getting to the stage where the average fund, the average, is around about 100 million euros. Now, when you go and talk to some of these global institutional investors, the smallest check they write is $50 million, $100 million. They simply cannot invest in a lot of European venture capital funds, no matter how great your track record, no matter how great the entrepreneurs that you found in Ukraine or Poland or wherever it is, you're just too small to absorb the investments that they want. And that's where the fund of funds potentially, and it's still early days in Europe, that's where it potentially comes to the rescue. You create an investment vehicle that those big global institutional investors can credibly and realistically invest in. That's why we devoted so much time as Invest Europe to getting that off the ground over the last 7, 8, 9 years.
Yeah, and it's even more urgent for Ukraine because the checks are even smaller.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question here.
Yeah, Joël Ruiz as a bridge. We're a think tank on emerging economies, and we're part of the G20 process. My question is a direct follow-up of this discussion we just had. Suppose you have the fund of fund. What we want from funds is their money, of course, let's be pragmatic, but we also want the connections, we want a network, we want the capacity, the access to markets, the access to ecosystems, especially when we want to have our companies become global, or for that matter, the private equities funds which already exist to become global. So my question is very short. What do we expect from those funds of funds, except from their money? To which markets do we want to get connected, seen from the Ukrainian point of view? To which ecosystems, to which technologies, to which industries? What's the leap forward? What's the quantum jump on that?
Sure. Well, first of all, as you mentioned, it's a check size, right? So basically, it's a product for institutional to invest. It's number one. Secondly, I can tell you, I already mentioned that 80 American funds invested. So basically what happens that Americans are investing directly to Ukrainian startups, which is loss for the Europe, right? So basically, if I would be in the European Union board, I would say, guys, let's invest in the Ukrainian fund of funds, and they will invest in the local funds, 10 or whatever VC funds, and this is how we're gonna actually get exposure to the Ukrainian startups. That's it. So this is actually rational for European Investment Fund and for that other ones. It's number one. Second one is actually expertise, because to be honest, none of the Ukraine can manage fund of funds. And I know the guys from European Investment Fund actually mentioned they have managed 3 fund of funds historically, right? So basically they can put an expertise how to do this as well. So basically it's just a leverage, right? How the Ukrainian startups can be a part of the European venture capital ecosystem. This is rational. This is why we're pushing so hard, because it's so obvious to us sitting on the panel, but it's not obvious to the other people, the decision maker. And last year we got the commitment from the government, okay? Because the institutions want to have the government have a skin in the game, at least with a small check up to 10 million. So I believe we're going to push it very hard because it's a win-win. I mean, for all of us, for ecosystem, for the European one, and this actually was on our agenda because we had board meetings this year with the new elected 8 board members. Basically, like we need to push it up because this is in the best interest of Europe and our members.
Thank
It's
you.
a product. It's available, and we need to discuss it how to actually to position it for the European institutional investors like European Investment Fund and some other ones.
Okay, thank you. You have something to add?
Yeah, one brief comment on what we're looking for from the pan-European fund of funds. I think, you know,
Sorry, maybe beyond Europe as well. Maybe.
I mean, the absolutely fundamental thing that we're looking for is their money. I mean, the reason that we think there will be some benefit in creating this new investment vehicle at EU level is that we will be able to attract institutional investors that otherwise would not come to Europe. Now, over time, what we hope is that those institutional investors will simply get more comfortable with Europe. They might then eventually get to the point where they don't need to invest via the fund of funds anymore. They'll come direct to Lena. They'll come direct to Horizon Capital, and those relationships will start to be built. But the first thing that we want, to be blunt about it, is their capital. Everything else that flows, the sort of second round benefits are less important in this particular scheme than just getting access to those pools of capital that right now we feel we're closed off from.
Okay, thank you. Now I have a question from gentleman here.
Hi, I'm Derek Brooks. I'm with Flat World Partners, and we're launching an emerging markets private equity fund focused on impact and sustainability. And we've talked a lot in both the venture capital and seems the private equity space that most of the opportunity has come from export-oriented countries, but really companies. But what really concerns me is when you're thinking about creating an impact on people's lives with sustainable returns, is creating that capturing the domestic consumption, improving healthcare systems, improving access to finance, which Ukraine does lag behind the rest of Europe, right? We're not pretending that it isn't. So I guess, is there opportunity in that space? Is there a specific way you have to think about capturing it given currency volatility? And then the follow-up questions in terms of sustainability, environmental, social, and governance, are there particular concerns you have to look for in Ukraine? Every country is different. You know, we find that governance systems work really well in South America, but we have to be very concerned about the environmental aspects. Is that something that's easy to integrate, or does that impact returns to a point where it just needs to be a veneer and gloss?
Okay. Len.
Yeah, I'll jump on that. Don't be left with the impression that only export-oriented. Okay, so obviously that is an area that, and certainly sectors and companies that are kind of riding this export-oriented wave, they are performing and growing incredibly fast. So I mean, you know, we've seen 50% CAGR growth in terms of revenue CAGR for these kinds of companies. Now, in terms of domestic companies, we still invest in domestic companies. We still have, you know, put money to work. And for domestic companies, obviously you're also looking for growth that can outgrow the currency volatility. So healthcare and pharma, e-commerce, you know, logistics, that offers those kinds of opportunities. In terms of ESG, you know, by and large, you know, ESG, those standards are very high. You know, those standards are very high. High in terms of those projects where you have obviously an international involved, or, you know, EBRD still is one of the largest investors in the country. I mean, over, what, 12 billion euros, I believe. So those kinds of standards that they very much have supported and introduced, I mean, everybody sees that as really the you know, what has to be in place. So, I mean, you know, for all of the companies, 140 of them, we had to put in very high standards of governance, of environmental, social, and that is possible, and not only possible, but encouraged in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just pick up on that point that Lena raised in terms of sectors like healthcare. Our healthcare committee is one of our fastest growing, and we're seeing private hospitals come up. Why? Because the Minister of Health, a very passionate, a very professional, has really changed the way that the industry works. I remember I used to work in the pharma industry, and I remember the procurement. The procurement has been really cleaned up now, but it's the investments in the private healthcare. I mean, I've been to hospitals in Odessa, some of the best brand new cardiology centers, and you can see that. So we're seeing more and more interest in sectors like private healthcare. We have some openings coming up this year. So I think sectors like that are definitely on the rise.
And we're not even talking about renewables. I mean, over $1 billion into renewables. That's going to be covered tomorrow in a panel dedicated to renewables.
Yeah, and to add on this, there's a lot of local investors who do invest in local consumption. You know, they invest hryvnias, and we're just not talking about them today. So we'll take one last question from Dan.
Thanks very much, Dan Bilak from Ukraine Invest. I just want to revisit this issue of perception and reality that Lena raised and others have touched on. That in the vast majority of investors that I have spoken to, the thousands that I've spoken to over the last 2.5 years, the biggest issue isn't corruption, the biggest issue isn't government regulation, the biggest issue in the minds of most investors is the conflict in the East. And what impact does that have? They don't understand it, they don't understand enough about Ukraine, and the narrative, there's no single narrative that actually allows them to wrap their heads around it. There's nothing inherently detrimental about investing in a conflict zone. I mean, Israel has done a fantastic job of creating an IT sector that's a world beater, world companies, and it's in a perpetual conflict zone. The issue is that I think that we need to, the way you change perception, and I get there eventually. It's taken a lot of solving a lot of problems with the people inside government to solve the problems of investors, and a lot of it's been systemic. But the fundamental issue is telling success stories. And the more that we tell the success stories, and it can be even the ones that have been bought up by Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, etc., that shows that we have something to sell. We produce 130,000 engineers a year, some of the most sought after, highly educated people in the world, and we actually as a government have done something right in not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We give them a very low tax base, and so that there's an incentive for them to actually stay in the country. And it's cheaper and more cost effective for foreign companies to hire Ukrainian engineers in Ukraine to do this work. We'll get the unicorns eventually. I'm interested in creating R&D centers. I want that intellectual ferment. I want to see clusters come out. And more than anything else, I mean, we're going to be, we've taken some baby steps on the government side to help promote and seed, and we could do more. But frankly speaking, I'm panic-stricken that we're going to end up, government is like a hammer. And if you've got a hammer, everything's a nail. And we need to be a lot more supple about these things. I take the doctor's view, do no harm. And this is something we need to be encouraging. But it's really, Ukrainian Venture Capital Association, AmCham, European Business Association, those success stories of your members have to get better brought to the minds and the pocketbooks and the boardrooms of venture capital institutionals. It's not just our job. In fact, it's not even mainly our job in the government side. We will support it, just like we did with Ukraine House. This is exactly the kind of platform of cooperation we want to replicate going forward. And I think that this is it's a coup to have Michael here to actually get a view of this. And we need people to come to Ukraine. And the number of stories, when I start telling success stories to the investors I deal with, is like, wow, we had no idea. I mean, most people think the war is on the border with Poland. And then you say that Lviv is actually closer to Frankfurt than it is to Donetsk. And they go, wow, I didn't know that. And then, all you want is to get people to start coming and digging deeper. And it's happening. We just need to ramp up. Thank you.
I think what we're seeing this year is because of the growth of the members of the members of the American Chamber of Commerce, what we've seen, and then their regional office or their head office, when they look at the numbers in terms of growth, percentage of growth, which markets are growing most, Ukraine is up there, and so it is bringing attention. I think that's a good thing. I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree. I think in terms of getting the messages out, this has been a learning for us. I think, the things we do, we are a member-funded organization representing the interests of the members. But I think one thing that we have learned is when we publicly criticize what the government is doing, the first media that pick it up are the Russians. The Russians, they broadcast it saying, we told you it was bad, and even the thing. So I think it's being quite careful how we communicate that to the media. And also sometimes when we're dealing with corporates whose management have spent a long time in Russia, who have sometimes listened a lot to the story of what the Russian media is coming out. But I think it's something we are seeing. The members are seeing the successes, and I fully agree. Together we can get these messages out and get these good stories out, which we're trying to do.
We're from the Ukrainian government. We're here to help.
I think just to add to that, I think that there is a humility and a humbleness in Ukrainian DNA. And to get a story out, it's not typical that people are loud and showy and I'll give an example. One of our companies in Genesis, they're an online media and classifieds company, and within that company they have this IT school where they're teaching they're taking professionals from audit or IT and turning them into product managers and helping them to launch their own. Well, there was a woman, Victoria Ripa. You probably don't even know her name. This woman in 2 years built a $30 million business. Top 5 health and fitness app in the US. Okay? Like just this morning, I found out she was featured by Snapchat as their first Central and Eastern European success story. How many people in this room have heard of Victoria Ripa? No. Okay, I mean, so I think that those kinds, we do have to get better and less humble about really talking about success stories, because often we tend to go into this isn't what the government's doing or that's not what the government's doing, instead of talking about, look at all these great things that have happened.
Yeah, and it's really a challenge for us, and I think we're doing a great job overcoming this challenge. We're going to wrap up, and before thanking all the speakers, one note from me is that once investor actually decides to enter the market, it's very important that the people, they are good and reliable people, and partners are good and reliable partners, and they do have a very reliable and trustworthy service provider, which is who EBS is. So we're ready to support acting investors and future investors. And I'm very thankful to our speakers. I think it was a very interesting panel. And thank you. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Полетів бим на край світа, як вітер штовх поле літа, гей, в Гамерицький край. Лем жаль митя моя хижо, лем жаль митя моя хижо,